Hi, this is Marty Wilkinson, and I am doing my presentation on intergroup contacts and influences on interracial peer exclusion. What this means is that the current study actually evaluated instances where there was peer exclusion that took place at the elementary, the middle school, and the high school level, where African American students were excluded from specific social situations by white students. And the storytelling in the interview process involved scenes such as being excluded from the lunch table, being excluded from an invitation to a sleepover, or at the high school level, being excluded from an invitation to a dance. The study focused on African American students in the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th grades. And the reason why the researchers used different age groups was so that they could look at developmental differences in how students perceived being excluded or rejected from these social situations. It also utilized both urban and suburban youth populations. In other words, students attended schools like in New York City as well as the greater metropolitan Washington, D.C. area. That way they were able to look at students who attended schools where African Americans actually represented most of the student body, and then they contrasted that with student populations where African Americans were actually amongst the minority and they were within a more diverse situation. When I read research, I like to look at the theoretical frameworks behind it. In other words, what type of theory actually informed the research. And the researchers here actually utilized the social domain approach, where students kind of made judgments based upon like morals, social conventions, and personal and psychological preferences. For instance, if a student felt like he or she was being discriminated against because of, racial discrimination, then it kind of would fall under the moral domain, like under social justice, human rights, fairness, and equality. Or let's say, students' perception of being discriminated against was based more on social conventions such as norms, group functionings, and customs, which had absolutely nothing to do with race. Or on personal and psychological preferences, like personal choices, individual prerogatives. And another framework that they utilized was developmental social identity theories, where children and adolescents use different social reasoning. For instance, older students tend to use multiple form and reasonings when they're examining, like a situation where they're being excluded from their peers. The researchers also utilized intergroup contact theory, where students experience social and developmental benefits from diverse populations. There's a reduction of prejudice and bias with dominant and minority groups when there is a very diverse environment. Intergroup contact is primarily, social contacts between minority students and non-minority students. Intergroup contact is not as influential on minority group members. In other words, some of the previous research has indicated that white students actually kind of benefit a little bit more from intergroup contact than, say, minority group members. Yet minority group members are also more likely to report race as a factor in practices that utilize group exclusion. Intergroup contact with dominant peer groups also can generate positive outcomes, like students who are in more diverse populations will see a difference in how racism and prejudice is evaluated. Intergroup contact could also have different results in student populations where ethnic minorities are the dominant group, such as the sample population from New York. And the question does remain on how intergroup contacts amongst African American students influence reasoning, such as in regards to the practice of exclusion and understanding like what makes a dominant group uncomfortable in interracial interactions. The sample for the study was 158 African American students in the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th grades. The researchers deliberately picked exclusively African American students due to the high levels of discrimination they traditionally experience. One group of students attended the minority-majority school in New York City. The second group attended suburban schools in the metropolitan Washington, D.C. area. The hypothesis looked for students having a low level of intergroup contact to be more likely to view race as a basis for peer exclusion. Participants in all age groups will view explicit race-based exclusion as wrong. Older students are less likely to view non-race-based reasons of exclusion as wrong due to an increased understanding of context. Students will also be more likely to apply moral reasoning in school settings than in home settings. Older students will also report a higher frequency of both race and non-race incidents of peer exclusion. In other words, older students are more likely to go, yeah, there's race reasons and then there's non-race reasons as to why we've been excluded. Older students are also more likely to consider social and historical factors in the use of stereotypes as well as racism. Informed consent was obtained from the parents, and child assent was also obtained for the study. African American women were trained to interview students on how to ask questions, present the scenarios, and record the responses. They were also blind as to the purpose of the study, and the studies were conducted in either quiet rooms or quiet areas at the school locations. And the measurement that they used was social reasoning about exclusion interview, where they presented a scenario where somebody was excluded from the lunch table, a sleepover where somebody was excluded from a sleepover, dance where somebody was excluded from a high school dance. And all these scenarios depicted a white student excluding a black student. The reasoning assessments that were used in the study asked students questions about what was the motive for the exclusion, how wrong was it to do a race-based exclusion, how wrong was it to do a non-race-based exclusion, group functioning exclusions, justifications for exclusions, and frequency of both race and non-race-based exclusions, as well as assessing stereotypes that were being used. For the reliability, there were 2 independent raters that were trained to code the responses, and they did do an additional survey for developmental intergroup contacts, which looked at how many students are from racial and different ethnic groups than your own, how many friends do you have who are from a different racial or ethnic group. And what they found was that suburban students reported higher rates of intergroup contact. Urban students with lower levels of intergroup contact were actually more likely to attribute a racial motive to peer exclusion in the sleepover scenario. Race was not necessarily as big of a factor in the school lunch or the school dance settings. Students with higher levels of intergroup contact were also more likely to, affirm the fact that, race-based exclusion is wrong. Younger students were more likely to view non-race-based exclusions as wrong than their older counterparts, and it's consistent with studies that indicated that older students are more likely to see situations where all parties recognize and have agreed upon set specific criteria for exclusion. And the sleepover scenario also resulted in students considering the role of, like, say, the white students' parents in excluding them. And they found a very surprising thing as far as participants' use of stereotypes, where students use stereotypes to explain why exclusion may occur in a lunch scenario, comments about general differences between white students and black students. But keep in mind, though, that these stereotypes that were used were in no way derogatory. I think one example was a 10th grader said, white kids just kind of think differently than black kids. And some of the strengths of the study I found was the focus on students in both urban and suburban populations. It presented consistent scenarios in the interview process. It took into account developmental differences in the age group, and I believe that the use of blind interviewers did help prevent an element of bias from being present during the interview process. The weaknesses really did not take into account how African American students may interact with other quote-unquote minority populations such as Asian populations, Hispanic, or immigrants. It did not examine the role of teachers and administrators in setting school boundaries and guidelines for behavior such as like anti-bullying or school schedules. And it did not really examine instances where African American students may not have wanted to participate in these activities. And if you're interested in learning more about the study, this is the reference you can look at. It's from the Journal of Youth and Adolescence, and I hope that you got something out of this presentation. And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to give me a contact through ReggieNet. Thanks!